A financially ruined black widower purchased a 19-year-old woman whose parents were selling her at public auction. $20 for the final item of the day. A strong, compliant 19-year-old woman, called out the sheriff, his words carrying across the dirt-covered plaza in Lakewood Springs. The brutal June heat pressed down as townspeople observed, some standing in uncomfortable quiet, others watching with disturbing fascination at the horrific scene playing out. Isaiah Montgomery, 42 years old, widowed, and the sole black landowner in the region, positioned himself behind the gathering with hands balled into fists. The young woman standing on the crude wooden stage kept her gaze downward, her tangled hair hiding a fresh mark across her face. Her parents, a pair weathered by difficult circumstances, observed with expressionless faces. 25! Came a rough shout from the opposite side of the street. Frank Holloway, who ran the neighborhood bar, lifted his arm with a grin that couldn't mask his dark purposes. The woman shook noticeably. $30. Another voice joined in. Walter Schmidt, a landowner notorious for his aggressive nature, particularly when intoxicated. Isaiah shut his eyes momentarily. $30 represented nearly everything remaining after the severe dry season that had destroyed his modest farm. This was money he'd saved for purchasing seeds for the coming planting season, his final opportunity to preserve the property he'd struggled to obtain following his wife's passing. $50. Isaiah's rich voice sliced through the crowds, murmuring. Complete stillness descended upon the square. Countless pale faces pivoted toward him simultaneously, displaying barely restrained shock and outrage. The woman's father squinted, his expression twisting with both disgust and avarice. I refuse to hand my daughter over to a 70. Isaiah cut him off, moving closer to the center while displaying gold pieces. The sheriff coughed nervously, clearly distressed. Mr. Montgomery, I don't believe you should use legal statutes. Permit any free citizen to participate in public sales, Isaiah stated firmly, maintaining eye contact. Unless you wish to clarify to a federal magistrate why you rejected the top offer. For the first time during the entire auction, the young woman raised her head. Briefly, her eyes connected with Isaiah's. What he saw wasn't hope, only acceptance and exhaustion far too profound for someone her age. 70 going once, the sheriff reluctantly announced. Holloway and Schmidt looked at each other, but nobody else made another bid. Final sale, declared the sheriff, striking his small hammer. The square filled with angry whispers. As Isaiah stepped forward to complete the transaction, painful recollections flooded back, his deceased wife Abigail being degraded in this very square years before when locals attempted to force them from town, the unmarked grave where she'd been buried 2 years prior, succumbing to lung disease that no area physician would treat, the overwhelming isolation of his home since her death. The young woman descended from the platform with uncertain movements. At close range, Isaiah noticed additional old bruises covering her arms. She maintained her downward gaze as though harsh experience had taught her that looking up brought punishment. "What do they call you?" he inquired, maintaining respectful space between them. "Sarah," came her nearly silent response. "Sarah Collins," Isaiah acknowledged with a nod. "I'm Isaiah Montgomery." "I'm aware of your identity," she answered, catching him off guard. "Everyone knows." As they departed the square, the crowd's grumbling grew more intense. Good Lord, they handed the girl over to a black man. This won't end favorably. Someone ought to intervene. Isaiah sensed the hostile stares like daggers against his spine. Sarah walked one pace behind as though trained for this position. Passing the tavern, Frank Holloway spat toward the ground. 70 steep for something you won't possess much longer, Montgomery," he called out loud enough for all to hear. Isaiah remained silent, continuing toward the wagon stationed at town's edge, where his aged horse waited calmly. While assisting Sarah aboard, he observed her trembling, not from fear of him, but from something worse, anticipation of what lay ahead based on everything she'd already survived. "I won't harm you," he said quietly enough for her ears only. You have my promise." For the first time she met his gaze directly. Her eyes showed not just pain, but a spark of something Isaiah immediately recognized, the same quiet resolve that had sustained him in a world determined to see him fail. "Why did you do this?" she asked simply. Isaiah didn't respond immediately. He guided the wagon forward before saying, "Because I understand what it means to be treated like property." As the wagon departed town under the residents' hostile watch, nobody observed the small metal item Sarah concealed in her worn boot, nor the brief look she shared with a shadowy figure. There was far more to this seemingly broken young woman than anyone could have suspected, something that would permanently alter Lakewood Springs' destiny. If tales of inequality, bias, and unexpected bravery move you, make sure to subscribe to discover how Sarah's apparent helplessness and Isaiah's dangerous compassion will ignite a transformation that nobody in that community will ever forget. Isaiah's home sat 6 miles outside town, isolated among drought-stricken fields and a small grove of oak trees. When they reached the property, darkness had fallen, casting the landscape in deep blue shadows. Sarah quietly examined the surroundings, the humble yet well-kept building, the small stable, the stone water source surrounded by a drought-damaged garden. "Here we are," Isaiah said, stepping down from the wagon. "It's modest, but it belongs to me. Nobody will disturb you here." Sarah stayed seated on the wagon, her eyes measuring distances, evaluating possible escape paths like a trapped creature. When she finally climbed down, she maintained several steps of distance from him. "There's a chamber in the rear," Isaiah explained. "It belonged to my boy. It has a lock that works from inside." The reference to a son made Sarah's brow furrow. "Your boy?" Jacob passed with his mother. "Lung sickness." "2 winters back," Isaiah answered, his tone free of self-pity. He was 5 years old. Inside the dwelling, a lantern already burned on the main table, evidence that someone had visited recently. Sarah caught this detail, her posture immediately tensing. "Hold on," Isaiah said, noticing her unease. He quickly checked the house before relaxing. "Ruth stopped by. She brought food." At the mention of the name, Sarah reacted. "Ruth Wilkins? The birth attendant?" Isaiah nodded, surprised. "You know her?" "She helped deliver my mother once," Sarah replied evasively. The cabin was basic but arranged with careful precision. Books stood perfectly aligned on improvised shelves, a cedar table, darkened with age but polished to gleaming. This wasn't the chaotic space of a broken man. It was the disciplined sanctuary of someone who refused surrender. "You plan to flee tonight, don't you?" Isaiah asked calmly during their meal. Sarah froze, her body rigid as a wire about to break. "I don't fault you for it," he continued. "But 3 men are watching the eastern woods. Bounty hunters the mayor hired after 3 enslaved people escaped from the Sullivan farm." "I'm not enslaved," Sarah shot back. "No, you're not," Isaiah agreed, "but try convincing those men of that in darkness." The following morning, Sarah discovered the house empty and the door unlocked. She wasn't confined. Through the window, she watched Isaiah laboring in the withered garden, attempting to revive dying plants with well water. While searching the house for money or valuables, Sarah found something unexpected, a book of federal statutes marked in multiple places with careful annotations. Beside it lay correspondence, signed by Professor Williams from Boston University. Before she could examine further, she heard approaching horses. 3 riders entered the property. Sarah recognized Frank Holloway, joined by Walter Schmidt and a 3rd man, well-dressed with a deliberately pleasant expression. Isaiah set down his farming tool and approached them, standing erect with an impassive expression. "Montgomery," Holloway said with false friendliness. "We've come to present Mr. Davis, the new county magistrate." The tall man inclined his head in greeting that didn't reach his eyes. "Mr. Montgomery, I've heard considerable talk about you." "We're performing a property assessment," Judge Davis explained, "to update county records." "My property taxes are current," Isaiah responded. "They always are." "This isn't about taxes," Schmidt interrupted with a spiteful smile. "It concerns suitability. Davis elaborated. Unproductive land might be seized for more effective use. Sarah watched Isaiah's jaw clench, though his expression stayed neutral. This property has been registered under my name since 1869, with all proper documentation. Times evolve, Montgomery, Holloway chuckled. Laws change. When the men finally departed, Sarah confronted Isaiah. They want your property. They always have, he replied, returning to his work as if nothing had occurred. Why? It's nearly destroyed by drought. Isaiah paused. Because there's something here worth far more than a few acres of parched earth. That afternoon, Ruth Wilkins arrived in her covered cart. She was a middle-aged black woman with commanding presence and sharp eyes. She brought supplies, seeds, and information. The new judge examined 5 properties today, she reported, while inspecting Sarah's injuries, all owned by blacks or immigrants. Isaiah nodded as though simply confirming his expectations. And this, Ruth handed him a sealed letter, came today by wire. Jenkins requested I deliver it quietly. As Isaiah read, his expression shifted to cold resolve. Sarah, he called, I need to know precisely what you overheard during your father's meetings with Mayor Marshall. The shock on Sarah's face was brief. How do you know about those? Why? Ruth interjected gently. You're not the first young woman we've helped escape that household. It was then that Sarah understood. He hadn't purchased a girl at a brutal auction from random mercy. The item in her boot, a small decorative key, suddenly felt infinitely heavier. My father keeps a crimson ledger locked in his desk, she finally disclosed. Payment records, names, dates. Mayor Marshall is planning something major, something involving Judge Davis and Riverside property. Isaiah and Ruth exchanged meaningful looks. Is that why your father was willing to auction you so publicly? Sarah nodded, the first tear finally falling. I've heard too much. I've witnessed too much. In town, gossip spread like wildfire about the black man who dared purchase a white woman, about mysterious nighttime visitors to his land, about the proximity to the railway line that would connect the county to newly discovered mineral deposits. Nobody noticed the small crimson book missing from Mr. Collins's house, or the coded messages transmitted by wire late at night. What Lakewood Springs' powerful elite didn't realize was that sometimes those considered invisible see most clearly, and that true revolution begins not with shouting, but with whispers and shadows, and schemes woven by hands with nothing to lose, only a future to claim. Days following Judge Davis's visit, an unexpected tempest struck Lakewood Springs. Nobody observed the small figure moving behind the town hall during the confusion, a dark cloak shielding her from curious eyes. Sarah Collins, whom everyone assumed was confined as Isaiah Montgomery's possession, had penetrated the core of local authority. The key in her boot, stolen from her father's desk weeks before, finally served its purpose in the mayor's chambers. Meanwhile, Isaiah entered the telegraph office completely drenched. Jenkins, the operator with quiet sympathies for the oppressed, simply nodded. The wire to Boston is open, he said softly, leaving Isaiah alone with the equipment. The next morning brought merciless sunshine. Mayor Marshall, Judge Davis, and 3 wealthy landowners assembled at Holloway's Tavern, visibly agitated. What do you mean, vanished? Hissed the mayor, pale as paper. Documents don't simply disappear. The safe was secured, replied the judge, nervously adjusting his collar. Only you possess the key. Frank Holloway poured another round of liquor. What about the black man, Montgomery? I always suspected that fellow was trouble. Impossible, Marshall dismissed. He could never access City Hall undetected. What none of them knew was that at that precise moment 6 copies of the stolen documents were being displayed at the church entrance, the marketplace, and City Hall. Ruth Wilkins, with the calm manner of someone handling routine business, was posting the papers that would reveal the conspiracy, a plot to steal strategic land before the official railroad announcement. When the church bells struck 10 o'clock, A special train reached the small station. 3 men in pristine suits disembarked: a Continental Railroad Company representative, a federal officer from the Interior Department, and a Boston Globe journalist. Isaiah greeted them and led them down Main Street, where crowds were already gathering around the posted notices. The commotion intensified as ordinary citizens discovered the scope of corruption documented in Collins's Crimson Ledger. "These are fabrications," shouted Mayor Marshall, emerging from the tavern entrance. "Complete lies!" "Including your signature on every page, Mayor?" asked the federal representative politely. "Or perhaps the diagram detailing how you planned to redirect the original railroad path to benefit illegally obtained property is also false." Walter Schmidt attempted to flee through the rear exit, only to find the sheriff blocking his path. "Did you know?" Schmidt asked in disbelief. "Not everything," the sheriff replied, "but enough not to prevent what's occurring." The crowd continued growing. Faces that would typically avoid Isaiah now stared at him with mixed shock and grudging respect. But the real surprise came when Sarah emerged from the church, accompanied by Reverend Thornton. "This young woman," announced the Reverend, "at tremendous personal risk, has provided essential evidence of crimes affecting every citizen of this community." Sarah stood tall, her eyes meeting the furious gaze of her father, who had just arrived. "You!" Collins snarled, lunging toward her. "I wouldn't attempt that," the federal officer intervened. "Your daughter has already given us sufficient details about how you and the mayor have falsified property documents belonging to at least 7 families over the past 2 years. A telegram was publicly delivered to Judge Davis. The Massachusetts Bar Association has keen interest in discovering how a man expelled for judicial misconduct is now serving as a judge in another state," the reporter observed. "You can't do this," the mayor hissed, looking desperately around. "This town belongs to me." "Belonged," corrected the railroad representative. "The Continental Company is particularly interested in learning how our confidential plans were leaked prematurely." The chaos that followed was thoroughly documented. The mayor's failed escape attempt, Holloway's desperate confession, Collins's angry protests as officers seized the Crimson Ledger from his residence. The most extraordinary moment came when Sarah publicly confronted her father. "You sold me," she declared without wavering, "as though I were less than human, just as you sold this town's dignity." Collins, cornered, revealed the full extent of his cruelty. "What did you expect? Your mother fled because she couldn't stand looking at you, the living reminder of our failure. You were never worth the breath in your lungs." The silence that followed was broken by Isaiah's steady voice. "Every person in this square has identical worth, Mr. Collins. That's the truth you attempted to bury, that human dignity has no price." As the conspirators were led away, the turmoil only intensified. Some demanded immediate justice. Others, including some who would once have despised Isaiah, now sought to align themselves with moral victory. Few noticed the quiet discussion between the railroad representative and Isaiah, or how the federal officer carefully examined Montgomery's property deeds. Nobody observed the glance exchanged between Ruth and Sarah when the reporter requested interviews. The town had been shaken to its core, but one question lingered in the air, whispered in corners of the square as the crowd dispersed. How had a black man and a young woman who had been sold managed not only to survive, but to defeat the powerful men who controlled every aspect of that society? The answer lay in the displayed papers, in the letters exchanged with Boston, and in the plan that had begun long before the auction. A plan whose seeds were planted years earlier when a college professor met a former enslaved person determined to change the world one letter at a time. 6 months after the day that transformed Lakewood Springs forever, the sun rose over a changed community. The railroad station, once merely a project used for manipulation, now stood real and impressive on the edge of Isaiah Montgomery's property. His land, far from being seized, had become the center of the new commercial route, a decision made by the Continental Company after discovering that the original route proposed by Mayor Marshall would cross unstable ground. Isaiah's modest cabin now shared space with a school. What started as makeshift lessons for 3 black children rejected by the city's educational system quickly became an institution attracting families from surrounding communities. Sarah Collins, or rather Sarah Montgomery, as she was now known, after a simple wedding ceremony performed by Reverend Thornton, managed the classes with the same quiet determination that had toppled an empire of corruption. "I never thought I'd become a teacher," she remarked one afternoon watching 20 students, black, white, and immigrant, under the large tree that served as their classroom on warm days. "I was always the girl who could barely raise her eyes when someone spoke." Isaiah, who was constructing new desks for the main room, smiled. "I always knew you had fire within you. You just needed space to breathe." Former Mayor Marshall was serving time in the state prison, convicted of fraud and extortion. Judge Davis, exposed, had disappeared in the night, though rumors suggested he'd been arrested in Chicago under an assumed name. Frank Holloway had lost his tavern to creditors and now worked as a dock worker on a distant river. As for Sarah's father, Collins, public shame had led to a decline that transformed him into a shadow of his former self, now surviving on charity, a pitiful figure everyone avoided. "We've received a response from Benson," Ruth Wilkins announced during the weekly dinner that brought together the core group responsible for transforming the town. Jenkins, the telegraph operator, and Sheriff Jensen, who had finally found courage to stand on the right side of history, completed the group. Benson, the Boston University professor who years earlier had recognized the legal brilliance of a self-educated former enslaved person seeking to understand his rights, the same man who had suggested that Isaiah purchase that particular piece of land, seemingly worthless, decades before the railroad became reality. "He accepts our proposal to expand the educational project," Ruth continued. 15 scholarships for young people from here. 15 transformed lives," Sarah whispered, her hand unconsciously touching the small scar on her wrist, a reminder of a previous existence that seemed to belong to someone else. The next day, when the first commercial train officially arrived at Lakewood Springs Station, there was a small ceremony. The new mayor, an honest businessman elected after a special election, spoke words of progress and renewal, but all attention was on the Montgomerys standing modestly to the side. "It's because of you," an elderly woman whispered to Sarah, the same lady who had looked away when she'd seen her on the street months ago. "My son got work at the station. They would never have hired a boy like him before." Her son, a young man with one leg shorter than the other, waved cheerfully from across the platform, wearing his railroad uniform with pride. "We didn't accomplish it alone," Sarah replied, smiling genuinely. "That's what they don't understand about justice," Isaiah explained later as they walked home under the orange evening sky. "It's not just about punishing the guilty. It's about building something better on the ruins." Sarah stopped, looking down at the city spread below them, lights beginning to twinkle in windows. "When I was on that platform being sold like livestock, all I wanted was revenge," she confessed. "I wanted everyone to suffer as I had." Isaiah nodded understandingly. "And now," she continued, "now I understand that true freedom isn't just breaking chains. It's building a table where everyone can sit." She looked at the man who had risked everything for her, not from pity, but from principle. "They tried to convince us that we were worthless, that I was just merchandise, and you were just an intruder on this land. And we ended up proving that our value was never for sale," Isaiah added. On the horizon, the towers of the new train station stood against the blazing sky, a symbol of an economy that now benefited everyone, not just the powerful. In the schoolrooms, maps and books promised futures that had been unimaginable just months earlier, and in City Hall, where schemes of exploitation had once been hatched, a diverse council now met weekly to discuss community improvements. Neither of them could have predicted how that desperate act in a dusty square, a black man buying a young woman at auction, would become the spark that would not only expose established corruption, but also kindle a fire that now illuminated hundreds of lives. "The real revolution," Isaiah used to tell his students, "is not tearing down walls, but building bridges where there were once only chasms." In a society built on divisions, Isaiah and Sarah had proven that true human dignity transcends race, class, and circumstance. that when people deemed inferior refuse to accept the limitations imposed on them by others, entire worlds can be transformed. "They tried to break us," Sarah would tell new students on their first day of class. But they forgot that sometimes broken things reflect light in ways that whole things never could. If stories of social transformation, courage in the face of injustice, and the triumph of the human spirit over oppressive systems move you, be sure to subscribe to the channel for more narratives that remind us of an eternal truth. A person's value can never be defined by how much others are willing to pay for them, but by how much they are willing to fight for what they believe.